Hey everybody, welcome back to the Whiskey Advent Calendar. We're on day 9, which means we have 8 days behind us. We're a third of the way to Christmas and a third of the way done with the Whiskey Advent Calendar. 8 whiskeys down and 16 to go. So let's kick it off with today's whiskey, which is Bourbon. It is the first wheated bourbon that we're going to have in the Advent Calendar, and I believe it is the #1 selling wheated bourbon in the United States and maybe the world. I'm talking about another crowd pleaser, something that you're going to find in pretty much every bar and most restaurants. Maker's Mark. So Maker's Mark is so popular that I think there's probably a good chance that a lot of you might have this sitting on your shelf at home. If so, I'm sorry. I didn't want to be super bland and give everybody a bunch of whiskeys that they already had. But I think there is good reason to include this on the list. It's a really popular bourbon, but it's got a lot of cool facts about it, and Maker's Mark does some pretty cool stuff with their distillery as well. So they're owned by Beam Suntory, the company that owns Jim Beam and all the Suntory whiskeys and a lot of other alcohol companies as well. But they're their own distillery. They do their own thing. I believe they're in charge of their own production, and it's really cool what they do. So let's talk a little bit about what a wheated bourbon is. So I want to distinguish between a wheated bourbon and a wheat whiskey. So we know, among other things, one of the requirements for something to be a bourbon is that it has to include at least 51% corn in its mash bill, in its ingredient list. That's what it has to be made up of, what the spirit has to be distilled from. At least 51% corn, could be more. A wheat whiskey, on the other hand, such as this one right here. This is a Woodford Reserve product made by Brown-Forman. This is a wheat whiskey. And in order to be an American wheat whiskey, the ingredient list has to be at least 51% wheat. That's what the mash bill has to be made of. So a wheat whiskey, by definition, cannot be a bourbon. You can't have 51% corn and then another 51%. It just doesn't make sense. So bourbon can't be wheat whiskey can't be bourbon, but you can have a wheated bourbon, like we talked about in one of the previous videos a little bit. So mostly corn goes into the bourbon, it has to, and there's usually 3 grains in any bourbon. Sometimes there's 4, but there's usually 3. The corn is the largest component, and then the smallest ingredient, or the least amount, the ingredient that there is the least of in any bourbon, is usually malted barley. And that's because it's not usually used for the flavor of the bourbon. It's used almost as a necessity, because malted barley, there's enzymes in it when the barley is malted that allows the starch from the grains to convert to sugar, to convert to alcohol. So it becomes necessary really for the chemistry, the making of the spirit itself. So there's usually a little bit of malted barley in every bourbon. But that second ingredient of the 3, it's usually called the flavor grain. It's what's used to bring out different flavors in addition to the corn. And in most bourbons, that's rye. So you'll hear of low rye or high rye bourbons like we've talked about before. But in a wheated whiskey, as opposed to like a 4-grain one, there is no rye. So in Maker's Mark, there is no rye whatsoever. You got mostly bourbon, then wheat, and then malted barley. And I believe in Maker's Mark, it's 70% corn, I think 16% wheat, red winter wheat, and then 14% barley. So not a ton of wheat, but it does make a pretty big difference. So enough about that. Let's get into the whiskey itself. Let's open it up. This has a wax a wax seal as well, which I'm not a big fan of, just like the Knob Creek. But it's so much easier to open than the Knob Creek is. So I'll cut some slack. Oh, maybe I spoke too soon. There we go. All right. Oh, I'm an idiot. It's a screw top. That's why I was having so much trouble. Weird. Didn't know that. Okay. And this red wax is actually, they've got a patent or a trademark on it. So they really do hand dip each one of these bottles in their bottling company. No one else can do that, apparently. And every now and then you'll see a limited edition that has a different color. I think there's like a Lakers championship one that's still floating around that was dunked in purple wax. So you'll see that every now and then. Okay, let's pour this baby up. Okay. And Maker's Mark, what is it, 90 proof? Yeah, 90 proof, 45%. So again, not bare minimum. It should still be a pretty easy sipper, even though it's not, you know, an even 40%. Alrighty. It's definitely a bourbon, but you get something that's a little bit, I think, sweeter, you know, than a lot of bourbons. It's got a little bit of like maybe a floral funkiness to it that's a little bit different. Maybe it borders a tad bit toward sour. I know there are some folks who pick up on a sour note pretty strongly in Maker's Mark. I'm not one of them. I mean, I get it sometimes, but not a whole lot. I actually really enjoy this brand, and I'll get into some of their other bottlings when we're done, but let's focus on this one. Yeah, and I think some of that floralness, any hint of sourness is kind of fading away. For me, it's just smelling more and more like a bourbon, so let's give it a taste. Pretty easy sipper, a bit more of a bite on the back end than I would have anticipated, but that could just be because it's the first whiskey of the night for me, and because I did just open the bottle on this one too, so it might be a little bit smoother for you in the sample that you get. I'm not getting a strong wheat forward profile on this right now, actually, which is a little unusual. I think I normally do, so my palate might just be getting used to it, so sorry for that, but I think it's pretty good. There we go. Okay, it's opening up a little bit more. And it does have almost that floralness is there, but it's also almost like a tiny hint toward like a bubblegum scent kind of buried in there. Yeah, but you really got to key in to try to find it, for me at least. Yeah, but that's not on the palate. I don't really get a whole lot of that on the palate. Tastes more like a fairly standard bourbon on the palate for me right now. It's good stuff. I don't think it's great by any means. And it's fairly cheap. I mean, you can get this for under 30 bucks. But it's good. And I think it's a really good introduction to bourbon, just because it is pretty easy to drink. It has kind of a classic bourbon profile, even though it has that wheat in there. And it's certainly a good introduction to wheaters, wheated bourbons, because you can get into stuff that's a little bit more distinct and unique with its wheated flavor profile. So one thing I think is really cool about Maker's Mark, it kind of like Glenmorangie, I think even more so than Glenmorangie, where they base, I believe, all of their products and all of their bottlings off of this product right here. They have this base product, and then they build upon this for all of their other releases, all of their other products. So if you like this and you want something a little heavier, a little richer, more flavor, a little bit more complex, but the same product, the same profile, I think you really just want to hop up in proof. So Maker's Mark came out in 2019 with Maker's Mark 101, which is just this product at 101 proof. So it's cut down to 101 instead of down to 90. And if you're feeling, you know, even ballsier, then you can go straight up to the Maker's Mark cask strength, which, you know, just like it sounds, is this product, but not cut down at all. But where Maker's Mark really shines and where it gets really creative is their wood finished products. So Maker's Mark, they don't use different recipes. As I said, everything's based on this, and they don't age their bourbons for any additional time in barrels that have held anything else, like sherry or other types of wine or rum, like some of these other bourbons do, to impart some additional flavor. What they do is they find different types of wood, and they treat them differently. So they can char one end and then toast it. They can have some toasted French oak staves and, you know, char level 3 Virgin American oak staves, but only charred on one side and chiseled on the other. They do some crazy specific stuff, and the product of that are their additional products. So I think a good place to go if you don't want to go the higher proof, but you want to explore what else Maker's Mark has, especially what I think is really just a better whiskey, is you want to go to Maker's Mark 46. And what this particular version is the cask strength 46, which is a limited release, but I think you can still find it in some spots. But you can find the standard Maker's 46, which I think is probably about 90 proof, just about anywhere. And all it is they put some French oak staves in their normal distillate and aged it for a little bit of additional time with those French oak staves in there, and it makes a big difference. It's sweeter, but also more complex, and there are some darker notes in there too. I really like it, especially the cask strength. It's pretty good. And their store picks they do them the same way. They have different types of stave profiles that these stores can choose how many of each to have put in the standard Maker's product to age, and they'll get a unique flavor, which is really, really cool, because you can buy different store picks, like one from Total Wine, one from your local liquor store, maybe even like Thriftway or someone has one, and they can be totally different because of the different types and amounts of wood that have been put in there. It's really, really cool. I don't know any other distillery that does that sort of finishing and that allows store picks to happen that way. And then Maker's Mark, they have their own experimental wood finishing limited releases that come out that are outstanding. So they just get really experimental with it. This is the first of their limited releases from 2021. It's called the Wood Finishing Series FAE01. FAE stands for fatty acid esters, and really, I don't know why they described it that way, but they just don't filter this at all from the barrel. So this is all straight from the barrel, maybe watered down a little bit, but I don't think so. And because it's not chill filtered, you get richer, deeper, more textured flavor, and a better mouthfeel, I think. This is fantastic. They just came out with another one that I need to get, which is the FAE02, the second release of this year. I really want it. It's supposed to be pretty great. But this is fantastic. I really like Maker's Mark. Their entry-level one is pretty good, but if you're at all interested in this, like this at all, I really strongly suggest you try out the Maker's 46. And if you like what they did with that, then you're probably going to fall in love with Maker's in general. So hope you found this helpful. Hope you found this interesting. Hope you liked Maker's. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or to leave a comment. And yeah, we can drink some Maker's together. Cheers, everybody. Merry Christmas.